Why do players want the most powerful items, the most powerful spells, and the highest stats they can have? If you've ever questioned that instinct or wondered why players make this choice, then this video is for you. Simply put, players believe that this is the best, if not the only, form of control they have to influence the outcome of the game. Players will often rely on their highest stats. In 5th edition, many often said dexterity was the best to have, and you'd be a fool for having a low dexterity or having dex as your dump stat. Look back at older editions where spellcasters were clearly the more powerful classes, and even if we look at other TTRPG systems like GURPS, you're encouraged to put skill points into the things that you're going to be attempting to do the most. Even if we zoom out further, we can see that players will often look for an advantage in a game where the stakes are high, whether that's chess, basketball, tic-tac-toe. But this problem is most apparent in Dungeons and Dragons. Go to any D&D thread and you'll find plenty of discussions about spell rankings, ability metas, optimal spell selections. Every wizard should pick Fireball, every cleric should take Perception, and when gone overboard, it's sometimes called min-maxing. In my opinion, this is because of the assumed imbalance that players perceive between who can control the outcome of the story, or from what we will from here on out refer to as the levers of control. And in a game like Dungeons and Dragons, it's in these situations, the dice rolling, and in combat, where players feel like they have their hand on the lever. In some tables, the Dungeon Master creates a story and the players are part of it, or the players are the stars of this screen drama that the Dungeon Master has created. Or the players are just trying to survive the dungeon full of hell traps that their Dungeon Master has prescribed for them. In each of these situations, the players don't have a lot of easy to perceive control over what their characters are doing, only whether their characters are successful or not. And so it makes sense that for the few moments they believe that they have some control over the game, that they'll want the best outcome, as they think it's the only time where they have any modicum of control. And this can be a really hard illusion to break. It's one of the reasons why the system you choose greatly influences the way you make characters. If we were playing a version of D&D that only relied on luck for resolutions, no skill modifiers or bonuses, how would players react? What element of control would they have over the game? You would likely see an increase in chosen abilities that allow for a reroll, or for a roll to be ignored or predetermined. In a system like Blades in the Dark, you are encouraged to go in headfirst without a plan, because you can rely on their flashback mechanic to overcome new obstacles, which leads to more harebrained plans. In a system like D&D though, spells have casting times, there are resource limitations, and bonuses that you can have, buffs and debuffs, so you'll want to cast your Pass Without a Trace and your aid before the plan commences. Going back to the levers of control, players are often under the assumption that their only lever is their character sheet, and it's why new players are often looking at their sheet for what to do instead of thinking of how their player would react. I'm using the term lever here, as in my mind, I imagine that there are multiple levers that each do different things, and that we can control each of the levers and modify our game to have different outcomes. If you want to view these as dials that have settings that you can increase or decrease, or even buttons that you can turn on and off, if that helps you to visualize this better, then do what works best for you. The first lever of control I want to discuss is the narrative lever. Players have much more control over the narrative than they think. The Dungeon Master may have a story and setting prepared, but much of the work of the DM is to react to players and their choices. The basic TTRPG loop is the DM describes the setting and presents a scenario. They ask the players what they do. They will then decide if a roll is needed, review the results of the player's decisions, and describe the scenario again as the world state has updated to the player's choices, and then ask the players again, what do they do next? This loop is simple, but in the asking players what they do next phase, players can often spend their time looking at their sheets, getting stuck in choice paralysis. Players can often fall into the habit of being passive. They may ask to roll a check or ask a clarifying question, but majority of the time they're waiting for the Dungeon Master to drive the narrative forward. This is the prime opportunity for players to control the narrative. And I would like to challenge players to try taking control. Of course, there's a balance to all things, and you shouldn't be overstepping your DM, derailing their plans, or hogging the spotlight from the other players. But players can take control in ways that enhance the DM's story and helps to iron out the wrinkles. When a DM asks what players are doing, this is just as much an opportunity for players to create the world around them as the DMs. Players can interject truths about their backstories that relate to the current plot. They can provide tidbits of information that enhance the narrative as we're going through it, focusing on themes that relate to their own character. For example, the DM describes a marketplace where food and trinkets are being sold. One of the players says, "We used to have food stands just like this where I came from. They would sell candied apples that my mom would make us save all week for. That was all before the war. We've got some time. DM, do I see any candied apples being sold here?" In one sentence, this player has cemented the setting, revealed a bit of their backstory, asked a question the DM certainly did not prepare for unless they've got a list of candied apple vendors, and has teed up the next scene. This is the true play at heart of D&D. Some call it riffing, others call it making bits, but it's one of the places where that spark of fun can be born. Entire stories, beloved characters, and moments are created in the times where players take control and point the party in a direction. If done correctly, it can help sew up holes in the plot, alleviate headaches for the party, and smoothen out the rough edges of the story. While this concept may seem simple, its potential is great and can take a skilled or experienced player to properly pull off. You might not think it can have a great impact, but ask yourself, how many parties have grinded sessions to a halt by focusing on something completely inconsequential to the story or the session? A suspicious book, a chair, an NPC shopkeeper who's helped them every single time. Every time the question comes back to, "Players, what do you do now?" the players can and often do just choose to keep insight checking the bar owner of this town. If the players can grind the story to a halt like that, then I propose that they can do the opposite. Players have just as much control over what the camera is focusing on in any given scene as the DM, and I would argue if not even more control, as whatever players question or observe or inquire about, the DM has to continue to elaborate on, further enhancing and focusing whatever topic they're so choosing. The players hold a great amount of control in this respect, but it's even recognizing that they have this power in the first place that is the challenge. This power can greatly alleviate the pressure off the DM. When other players realize that they can create and show that they can be trusted, it allows the DM to release some of that control and restores that perceived power imbalance. Players can also relate to other party members, uncover parts of their backstory, as players are often keeping their backstories hidden, waiting for someone to ask about them, but not doing any of the asking themselves. A simple comment to another player about their past could help the other player begin to reveal their own past, taking the pressure off the DM to try to find ways for these players' pasts to naturally come up in this story that we're creating. Players can toss the focus of the scene to other players, much like a setter in volleyball setting up a spike. Each DM may have their own preference, but when players keep this lever in mind, it keeps them from focusing on their sheet and focus on their character and the world around them instead. To me, this is when players discover the true joy of TTRPGs. Now, we all want our characters to be good at things, to influence the story, and to succeed. There's nothing wrong with that. So players are often thinking, my highest skill is perception. How do I leverage that to overcome this obstacle? Even as a player grows in experience and begins to understand that there are levers of control outside of their character sheet, they will still often rely on their highest number and the biggest abilities they have when push comes to shove. Very rarely will a player ever purposely do something they know is suboptimal if they can help it. You may be thinking, but I've played a clumsy paladin, he always fails his acrobatics and his stealth checks, and we all laugh about it and have a good time. Yeah, of course, but you designed him to interact with the system this way. You didn't make him suboptimal, you didn't have con as his dump stat. But DM, why would players want to be bad at things? They want to succeed. And that may be true, but my experience tells me otherwise. While yes, they do want to succeed, they only wish to do so in the face of adversity, to overcome their weaknesses and triumph. And it's why the concept of flaws with mechanical penalties have still remained relatively popular, both with D&D and many other TTRPGs. a -4 to athletics while climbing due to a fear of heights, a disadvantage on fear checks when in the presence of your phobia. In a system like GURPS, you're allowed to take character flaws in order to gain more perks to enhance your abilities. Older editions of D&D often offered a bonus for picking a flaw, and this has largely been removed from modern D&D. Instead, your character has a flaw that they are encouraged to engage with because of RP reasons. But without the ability to choose what your character struggles with, it places more emphasis on trying to control what your character can succeed at. But DM, nothing is stopping you from making a character who struggles with vices or confidence or morality. Of course. But the mechanics supporting those choices would make the situations where you overcome the odds much sweeter. It further aligns the roleplay experience. So what does this have to do with the levers of control? One of the levers the players have is to choose how they fail. The lever of failure. How do they take their failure? And what consequence does it have in game? When do they choose to fail on purpose? Perhaps we have a bard who makes the choice that they never succeed an insight check against an attractive NPC. This is a choice that has a mechanical implication, gives the DM a thread to drive the plot forward with, and is only possible if the player uses that lever, if they make that choice. And later on in the story, when they finally grow and decide they're not going to auto-fail their insight checks, it'll be a point of character development. Perhaps we have a character who decides whenever they're bloodied, they stop focusing on the enemy and they focus on repositioning and healing themselves first. As time goes on and they get more experience, eventually they ignore this instinct, becoming more courageous. And it could be a big character moment, one that the DM did nothing to create. If these sound like terrible ideas to you, that's okay, because that isn't the extent of how we can control our failures. If your character fails a lockpicking check, do they ask the DM when they can try again? Or do they say to the party, hey, this lock is really tough. Anyone have any other ideas of how we can get in there? Or, hey, I clearly rubbed the NPC wrong. Anyone else want to take a swing at it? Both options take your failure and immediately toss control to another player instead of giving it to the DM. Giving another player to give input to riff or make a bit. A player can fail a check to hold onto a ledge and say, hey, while my character is feeling their grip loosen, I reveal this secret to this NPC that we've been traveling with before I fall to the bottom, locking eyes with them as I go, revealing a bit of a character tidbit, accepting the failure, but still controlling and describing the scene and the way it's playing out. It's subtle, but it takes skill to fail with grace. As opposed to failing and letting the DM describe what happens to your character, players can take that opportunity themselves, shaping their scenes and how their character reacts to failure. The last lever I will call the lever of verisimilitude or the lever of realism. You may hear this word in the TTRPG space a lot, often interchangeably with immersion and realism, but verisimilitude means the appearance of being real or true. This is something that all players have control over. And the more that the players look at the world around them as real, the less they rely on their character sheets to interact with it. How often do we describe our characters going to the restroom, cleaning the dishes, folding clothes, cleaning them? There are a million things we don't do in session that we assume our characters do in order to maintain that realism. If we were to focus on all of those things all the time, it would be downright annoying. However, if we do focus on parts of the world and its realism, we can bring the world to life in ways we may not have considered. Who is the NPC who cleans the office of the BBEG? Where do they get their food supply from? If players start looking at the world as real when they interact with it, they can make interesting discoveries without ever having to use their character sheet. If we have two examples, one in which the players go into a room, one player asks, can I search the room for any signs of anything that's hidden? The DC to search the entire room for anything hidden is likely going to be pretty high. However, if we have another scenario in which one of the players listens to the DM as he describes the room, with the DM describing a rug in the corner, a bed, a painting, a desk, and a closet. If the player simply states to the DM, I'm going to go behind the painting and see if I can pull it off the wall and see if there's anything hidden behind it, there's quite literally not a check required to remove the painting from the wall. And if there is something hidden there, they will have found it simply by virtue of listening, understanding the world around them, and interacting with the parts of the world that they see. So as players begin to use this lever, they can begin to ask themselves, who was the bartender at the tavern? Did they have a life before working here? Where is their family? Of course, this lever is to be used cautiously, because we play this fantasy world and the very notion of realism can reduce some of that fantasy. And also because a DM who isn't prepared for these kinds of questions may feel panic or may feel that their world is under scrutiny. But when players start treating the world as such, they can control the story in unexpected ways. Many players will see an NPC scenario as a charisma check and nothing more. But NPCs have wants, needs, desires, flaws. When players treat NPCs as real and interact with these personality traits, they can find much greater success and influence over the story than if they tried to rely on just a charisma check. One example I'll give is from my last campaign, where a group of vampires wanted the Empress dead for her betrayal against them. Trying to persuade them to help the party was nearly impossible unless they agreed to assassinate the Empress. But a player saw the vampires and their long-term goals, what they were trying to accomplish, and saw an opportunity to provide it to them without relying on killing the Empress. By understanding them and their wants, the player provided a solution without needing their sheet at all, and were able to gain powerful allies because of it. Not by relying on their stats, but by providing the NPCs with ways to attain their goals, treating their wants and desires as real. This is the power of the lever of realism, and players can fine-tune when they choose to use it. Players may be able to use their real-world experience in order to provide insight about details in the game. And while we don't want to overdo it, we aren't playing a physics game after all, players can add to the world in many ways the DM would have never considered. As one learns the game and grows as a player, they may start out thinking that the only control they have is over their sheet and the choices that they may make with their character. But a player can never attempt something they've never considered before. These discoveries are often magical, and by learning to control the narrative, the ways they fail, and the power of realism, players can shape their experience of D&D into one of joy and wonder, instead of one where you must always choose optimally.